When it comes to India's neighborhood policy, there are few countries that are more important than Nepal. Nepal is a country that has been an important Indian partner for decades. They've had at times a very, very closely cooperating relationship, but at times also a relationship filled with tension and distrust. It's a complicated relationship, and a new development in the India-Nepal relationship is gathering some interest. The Prime Minister of Nepal, KP Sharma Oli, is reported to be headed to China for his first visit since taking office as Prime Minister earlier this year. This is, of course, breaking with a tradition that we've seen in the past where Prime Ministers of Nepal typically visit India for their first visit in office. Some reporting coming in showing that in fact, India had not issued this invitation. Lots of speculation and concern about this, at least here in India. But joining us now is really one of the preeminent voices talking about Nepal's foreign policy, its relationship with India and its relationship with China, Amish Raj Mulmi, who is an author, a writer based in Nepal, who has written the fantastic book, All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China, which is really a fantastic book looking at some of the themes that we want to touch on today about Nepal, its foreign policy, its relationship with India, and its relationship with China. Amish, thank you so much for joining us. Could I ask you to just begin by helping us make sense of just this big headline that seems to be playing out in India right now, that Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli is going to be headed to China for his first visit as Prime Minister and not to India. Traditionally, of course, the Nepalese Prime Minister heads to India. Could you help us make sense of what this headline is, what's exactly happening in the relationship right now?
Thank you, Shashank, for having me. I think it's we are looking, perhaps he's not definitely the first. I think Pushpa Kamal Dahal Prachanda, he had broken the tradition much earlier in 2008. And before that as well, in the 1950s, another Nepali Prime Minister had broken this tradition. But yes, Prime Minister Oli has decided to break the tradition and go to China first. I believe that he had met Prime Minister Modi on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and I believe that he had extended an invitation to Prime Minister Modi as well. But news reports have suggested that Delhi has not sent him an invite so far. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if, Delhi is also looking at this from his personal, let's say, equations between the two leaders, between what Prime Minister Oli has said previously vis-a-vis India. So it's all in the realm of speculation, frankly. But what we know for a fact is that Prime Minister Oli is going to China first, I think in the first week of December.
Right. Now, Amish, you are someone who has chronicled Nepal's relationship with China a lot in recent years. Could you begin by giving an Indian audience a sense of Nepal's current relationship with China? Why exactly we have seen this turn towards China, increased Chinese investments in Nepal, increased Chinese role in Nepal's foreign policy more generally? Could you explain this broader movement that we're seeing in terms of the Nepal-China relationship?
I think it's in terms of China and Nepal, I think it's a larger question of where hasn't China expanded anywhere in the world, right? As elsewhere, as in South Asia and other South Asian countries, I think China is also on its way to becoming global power. It is reaching out to its neighbors, and I think Nepal is a very, very important part of that conundrum because it shares a long border, specifically related with Tibet, with Tibetan issues. So China has been paying attention to Nepal in the 21st century due to its increased investments in Tibet, due to its increased infrastructure in Tibet. It has now the capacity, now the will to sort of expand trade and connectivity via the northern border of Nepal. So that is obviously there. In terms of the larger question of how Nepal is looking at China, I think for this, you have to go back to 2015. You have to go back to the discord between India and Nepal at that time, and China's arrival as a sort of a political and economic alternative to India, and to seeing that Nepali leaders wanted to diversify Nepal's foreign relations, Nepal's economic relations. And I think what we are seeing today, almost 10 years later, is an outcome of that. And a lot of what you're saying in terms of investments, increased connectivity, yes, a lot of it has happened post the signing of the BRI. So one could argue that the BRI itself is a larger policy vehicle that leads to increased trade, increased connectivity between China and other countries. So I think Nepal is a larger part of that puzzle as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. Amish, if I could ask you, before we get into the specifics of the Prime Minister's visit to China, if I could ask you to lay out for an Indian audience what exactly happened in 2015 between India and China, because there are often differing perceptions of this, and sometimes a slightly more limited understanding of what happened, of how significant this incident in 2015 was to how Nepal and the ordinary Nepalese people view India's influence. Could you explain to an Indian audience what happened in 2015? Why was it so important?
I would divide it into two parts, right? The first is that in April, we had a massive earthquake here. Around 9,000 people died. India was the first to send aid. But of course, then there was, of course, a lot of backlash against the Indian media, sort of constant sort of like jingoism around that. But that was then. Then in September, we promulgated a new constitution, which of course did not meet the standards of a lot of local Nepalis as well, especially in the Madhes. And India was seen to be siding with them. India called it due to security reasons, but Nepal calls it a blockade. The border was closed off. And I think what happened at that particular juncture was there's a feeling among Nepalis, both politicians and the ordinary Nepali, that India had sort of used this economic leverage on Nepal to pressure it into accepting, let's say, changes to the constitution. And see, this is not the first time that India had imposed what Nepalis call an economic blockade on Nepal. It had done so in 1989. It had done so in the 60s as well. What was different in 2015 was the willingness and the capacity of China to come in even as a symbolic sort of alternative. At that time, the 2015 blockade was primarily marked by a shortage of fuel supply of petroleum products, and China stepped in and sent about 20 trucks of petroleum products to Nepal, and via the northern border specifically, right? And these 20 trucks were not going to satisfy any Nepali local demand for petroleum products, but what it was highly symbolic. And it symbolized that China now had the capacity and the willingness to cross over the Himalaya and appear as that alternative, the political and economic alternative to India that I was talking about. And I think that is why I believe that 2015 was a critical juncture in both India-Nepal relations.
Right. Now, let's get back to this question of China and the upcoming visit of the Prime Minister to China. Could you tell us a little bit about what might be on the agenda? We of course hear, of course, a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese investments in Nepal. If you could explain again, if I could ask you to explain again to an Indian audience, how the BRI is sometimes a contentious issue in Nepal. There are, Nepal is of course ruled by a coalition right now. There is a sense that one part of the coalition is not that keen on Chinese investments through the BRI. There's of course another coalition part of the coalition that is of course welcoming of these investments. Could I ask you to explain that tension over the BRI as well, while you also explain the broader agenda of the Prime Minister's visit to China?
Okay, so I'll first start from the agenda, then I'll go on to the BRI, let's say, like what the debates around the BRI inside Nepal. So in terms of the agenda, I see there are three primary agendas, right? The first is to implement, so China and Nepal have signed a lot of agreements in the past. So one of the primary agendas this time is to bring those agreements into implementation. So for instance, there's a lot of, let's say, like pending infrastructure agreements. There's a lot of pending, let's say, even trade and transit agreements. So I think it'll be one of the primary agendas this time is to bring those agreements into implementation. Related to that is the question of whether Nepal and China will sign a BRI implementation agreement. And I think that is also equally high on the agenda. Nepal, there's homework being done here, there's homework being done in China in terms of what the BRI implementation agreement will require, what it will entail, and how it will proceed. So this implementation agreement is essentially being seen as the foundation of allowing future BRI projects to be implemented in Nepal. And the third agenda that I see is for the conversion of the loan that Nepal has taken to build the Pokhara International Airport into a grant. So currently it's about a 250 million USD loan, and Pokhara International Airport, as you know, is not being currently operationalized. It's not generating enough revenue, and therefore the Nepal government has formally requested China to convert it into a grant. Now, all these three questions, it depends how it will be, how they will move ahead. Now, in terms of the BRI in Nepal, I think there is a contention not just within Nepal, but also between Nepal and China. I think between Nepal and China, the contention is essentially what the BRI is all about. China believes that the BRI is a policy measure. So it is not specific to any project. It is in fact, the BRI is a larger vehicle that allows for increased trade, increased connectivity, increased interactions, increased infrastructure agreements with China. So it also includes financial connectivity, increased tourism, all of that. That's according to China. And China believes, and Chinese ambassadors have said this over here, Chinese ambassadors in Nepal, that is, that any project that is any infrastructure project where a Chinese contractor or there is Chinese involvement can be considered a BRI project. On Nepal's side, however, that is not how Nepal has understood the BRI. Nepal understands the BRI to be project specific. Nepal understands that the BRI can only be targeted or only be labeled onto projects that have explicitly been listed as BRI projects, which were earlier 9, and now I think they've come down to 7 because 2 of the BRI projects, hydropower projects in particular, they are in talks to give them to Indian developers. So this is the essential debate between China and in Nepal. Now, inside Nepal, the question, or rather the main contention, is around the financing of BRI or infrastructure projects funded by China. A section of the Nepali polity believes that Chinese loans can become more concessional, that China also ought to do it with grants, that Nepal does not have the capacity to take any more Chinese loans, especially at about 2% interest rates, which is what we took the Pokhara International Airport loan at. And I think this is the larger debate, that I would even call it a debate as much as there is broad agreement that Nepal cannot afford any more massive loans, that if it has to take any loans, it definitely needs them at concessional rates, at World Bank or ADB rates, or even lower, or as a grant. And that is the primary, let's say, contention happening now between, again, Nepal and China. Like I said, one of the clauses of the BRI implementation agreement is about the funding modality, is about how this BRI projects in the future will be funded. So I think the debate around the BRI currently raises around these issues.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if I could ask you, a question more broadly on the India-Nepal relationship when it comes to KP Sharma Oli, he was, of course, seen to be very prominently associated with the movement to put more pressure on India to solve the border disputes. Nepal claims certain territory that India at this point in time controls. So that has been a topic of contention a couple of years ago and continues to sometimes pop up in the politics of both countries. Could you explain KP Sharma Oli's past history on India and in your perception of it, because you track relationships so closely, how much of those tensions continue to remain in the India-Nepal relationship?
See, in terms of KP Oli, I think what we have to understand is ultimately that he is a Nepali politician who banks on nationalism as a prominent, let's say, issue, or a prominent, I would call it, his support base depends a lot on his nationalism, let's say, like agenda, right? So, and we've seen that prominently, despite at one point of time during the 1990s, particularly, Prime Minister Oli being seen as particularly being close to India. So this switch has happened, of course, in the 21st century. And we have to remember, again, the earlier point that I was talking about the 2015 blockade. Prime Minister Oli was the prime minister at that time as well. And in one sense, he was taking ownership of the constitution, and India's rejection of that constitution was, he took it as an affront, right? And then subsequently, I think he has built a base around basically assertive Nepali nationalism. And I think he's done that quite well. He's succeeded, of course, electorally twice, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of basically what has happened in terms of the border dispute, I think it's intractable. It has become protracted. I think both parties, both Delhi and Kathmandu, are here to blame. Delhi is not willing to talk about it. Kathmandu is willing to talk about it, but there is no political leader in Kathmandu who's going to back down on these claims, because this entire border dispute has been linked to national sovereignty. And I think it requires a political solution, but none of the parties involved, neither Delhi nor Kathmandu, has the political wherewithal right now to talk about it. That is the key question here. The longer this border dispute goes on, the more intractable it gets, the more, let's say, like insolvable it gets. And it will raise, let's say, other KP Sharma Olis as well.
Right. Amish, if I could also ask you, some of the speculation from some of the experts has been that there continues to remain some tension in the India-Nepal relationship, particularly with the conversation is that KP Sharma Oli is not as enthusiastic about Indian infrastructure and connectivity projects. Could I ask you for your view on that? And also, could I ask you more broadly to characterize where you see the India-Nepal relationship at this point in time? What is working in the relationship and what is not?
I think, I'll start with the India-Nepal relationship. There's been a significant change in the past 7-8 years. I think India has started focusing a lot more on economic connectivity, which I think is Nepal's desire as well. I think with the recent signing of the tripartite agreement with Bangladesh, where Nepal is selling power to Bangladesh using Indian transmission lines, I think that is a fantastic beginning of a larger regional agenda, of a larger regional connectivity agenda in South Asia. India has focused a lot more on its infrastructure projects, delivering them. So, for instance, its ICPs on the border, its trade points on the border, on the railway lines that it's building inside Nepal, as well as other, let's say, issues, development works that it has done. So I think there has been a significant, switch in the way India has conducted its diplomacy inside Nepal in the last few years. Having said that, there are still some pending issues. And these pending issues are what bring out these little, I would say, contestations every now and then. So, for instance, one of the large contestations, one of the bigger debates around these India-Nepal relations at this current moment is the issue of India allowing new air routes into Nepal. And I think that is a big issue because that is being seen as one of the reasons why the 2 new international airports inside Nepal aren't being allowed to function properly, aren't being allowed to be operationalized, and are resulting in losses to the Nepali exchequer, right? But having said that, I think these sort of contentious issues keep coming back every now and then because it comes down to the more matter of trust. And again, what you said about India not being enthusiastic about Prime Minister Oli, I think the onus is equally on Delhi to sort of look beyond its personal equations with leaders in Nepal and in fact look at the larger bilateral relationship, to look at the larger, the larger connectivity agenda that it's put forth and which Nepal, along with other South Asian countries, has broadly accepted to and is actually quite enthusiastic about. So that's my point, that yes, as with any close relationship, as with an extremely close, in fact, between Nepal and India, there is actually no parallel. As with any relationship, there will always be contestation. There will always be certain disputes, right? But the larger fact is if you look at easing out the larger relationship in terms of a broader agenda, in terms of a long-term goal, I think these smaller disputes can be resolved well within time. But that's again the paradox, that the longer you allow these smaller disputes to fester on, the longer the more potential they have to become actual full-blown, let's say, disputes. Now, right. For instance, one other, let's say, debate that is happening currently in Nepal is that, India is not buying power from Nepal, from hydropower companies, Nepali hydropower companies that have Chinese investments in them. And these are questions that seem inexplicable to the Nepali, let's say, public, right? That if India is conducting business with China on its own terms, why cannot Nepal do so? Because Nepal is assuring India of its security interests, or whatever interests you may call it, right? So these are the larger issues, I would say, that define the relationship at this moment. I would argue that, yes, there's a lot of progress. The larger economic connectivity agenda, the larger regional connectivity agenda, I think it is well on its way. I think it is something that to be highly optimistic about. And I think the onus lies on both, let's say, Delhi and Kathmandu to look beyond these personal relations and to look at the national interest, to look at the long-term goal of this regional connectivity and economic development inside South Asia.
Right. Amish, could I also ask you, very recently we saw India and China reach a border patrolling deal that could pave the way for some normalization on the border between India and China after 4 years of tension. How is Kathmandu looking at this normalization this potential normalization, may I say, between India and China?
No, as I said earlier, I think obviously there's cautious optimism over here. India and China both are neighbors. I think it's a fact of geography that we have to live with both of them. the fact is, I think that even if India and China reach a normalized deal, the benefits of it have to be seen in South Asia and in Nepal. And I think these are the what I was referring to earlier about India not purchasing power from hydro companies that have Chinese investments or Chinese contractors. And now there is a new issue that has come up that India is not providing certification of Nepali consumer goods for exports because they have Chinese components in them. So these smaller issues, they seem to sort of suggest that India is not happy with Chinese, let's say, investment, Chinese capital, Chinese, Nepali companies using Chinese technology, things like that, right? And I think these are the issues that need to be normalized. Like if India is, like I said, if India is conducting business with China, why cannot the other neighbors do it? And as long as the security interests are being assured, as long as India's interests are being assured, I think that there is a valid question over here about why India is not refusing or not buying power from these companies now, at least. And I hope at least that this normalization of relations between India and China will allow, let's say, these smaller issues to get resolved. The other fact is the other long-term, let's say, agenda on Nepali political leaders' mind is that when at least before 2020, Nepal had seen itself as a transit state between China and China and India, in which it would act as, let's say, one of the shorter land routes between China and trading of goods and services between China and India. And it hopes that with normalization of relations between its two neighbors, that possibility exists again. But again, it is a possibility. I don't know what the future holds. So.
Right. Amish, I'd like to ask you one final question. You shot to stardom with your book talking about China or Nepal. It's turned to China. All roads lead north, and I would absolutely recommend it to all our viewers. Could I ask you a little bit about, to an Indian audience, what we've seen over the last couple of years is that in country after country, whether you're talking about the Maldives, talking about Bangladesh, and with Nepal, we've seen China come in with a greater diplomatic presence, greater economic investments, and so on. And this has brought in a lot of anxiety and concern, especially in the Indian strategic community. It often carries, may I say, an undertone of betrayal of some senses because, of course, we have such an established relationship. Could you, if I could ask you to close out with an explanation, speaking to a primarily Indian audience about the argument you were making in that book, and what, if I could ask you to explain, you already have during this interview, but this broader shift that we're seeing among many of our neighbors towards greater cooperation with China, and what India needs to do to compete in that part of the world. We've already heard some indications from the Indian government saying that, look, it is accepted that it lives in a more competitive reality. We aren't living in the 1960s. We have to accept that China is here and we have to compete with them more strongly. But could I ask you then to close out by explaining to us, from sitting in Kathmandu, having studied the relationship, how would you recommend India behaves with its neighbors or acts with key relationships like Nepal to sort of shore up its relationships and ensure that it can compete more effectively with China in the region?
See, I think there are several. I mean, one can write an entire thesis around this question. So I'll just try to sort of break this down, right? We have to understand what the roots of anti-Indianism in South Asia are, right? Like I think there's a lot of displeasure around the sort of cultural hegemony and the political hegemony that India has traditionally sort of like displayed in South Asia. I think that, again, this is I would argue that in the past, let's say 20 years or so, particularly in the last 10 years, there has been a certain shift from the Indian perspective for that, where these hegemonies have been sort of like downplayed and in fact the idea of linkages with the Indian economy, that the benefits, the advantages of linkages with the Indian economy have been put forth to South Asia. And I think South Asian countries, smaller South Asian states like Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, I think they're increasingly seeing the benefits of that as well. And which is why, like I said, there's so much enthusiasm around this tripartite power trade agreement between India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Having said that, I think what India needs to do from here on I would argue that regional connectivity is the primary goal. The more India, let's say, pushes the agenda of regional connectivity, the more India sort of takes its neighbors along on the rise of, let's say, on the path of economic development, on economic growth. I think increasingly that is what will, let's say, ease out things for India within the subcontinent as well. I don't think small states are not sensitive to India's concerns. I think Indian small states are particularly sensitive to Indian concerns. We have seen that constantly. I think small states in South Asia also realize that geographically they are more suited for trade, for relations, for expanded trade, for expanded all of these geographically they're more suited with India, which is also an economic center. So I think that understanding lies within small South Asian states. Having said that, in Delhi also must understand that it's not always an either or situation. It is not always like you said, it is a competitive world. And I think in this competitive world, small states also have more choices in front of them. Small state leaders want to make those choices. They see where the advantages, whether it's personal interest, whether it's national interest, where those lie. And I think that's where the game has to be played out, where India has to show the neighborhood, India has to show the smaller states in South Asia that it is more advantageous to be connected, to be linked, to be sort of trading with India, to be doing business with India on favorable terms. I think as long as, and like I said, in the past 6 years, 7 years, at least in Nepal, we have seen signs of that happening, where we have seen India withdrawing from visible day-to-day political management and instead focusing on the economics aspects of the relationship. The more it does so, the more I would argue that India will have a, let's say, easier time in the South Asian neighborhood.
Understood. Amish Raj Mulmi, one of the rising stars in the subcontinent, talking about Nepal's foreign policy, its relationship with India, its relationship with China. And again, I can't recommend the book highly enough. The author of All Roads Lead North, China, in Nepal's turn to China. Amish, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much to your viewers.
Thank you so much, Shashank.
And thank you so much, viewers, for joining us for this conversation on the India-Nepal relationship, as well as Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli's upcoming visit to China.